There is a particular kind of quiet that falls over a house in the last few minutes before everything in it changes, and on a gray Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, that quiet had settled over the Bennett house like dust. Daniel Bennett stood at the living room window with a glass of water he had forgotten to drink, watching a black car glide to a stop at the curb. It was not the kind of car that belonged on this street. Not really, though it had been years since Daniel had thought of this street as anything but his. The car was long and low and the color of wet slate, and the man who stepped out from behind the wheel wore a suit that fit him the way suits only fit men who are paid very well to look unremarkable. He walked around to the rear door and opened it and stood there, waiting, the posture of a man who has done this 10,000 times and will do it 10,000 more. Daniel's chest tightened in a way he didn't have a name for yet. He heard her on the stairs before he saw her. Claire came down slowly, one hand trailing the banister, wearing a coat he didn't recognize, carrying nothing but a single leather bag that looked as though it had been made specifically for her hand. She didn't look at him right away. She looked at the house first. The living room, the kitchen doorway, the small brass hook by the door where his keys had hung for 11 years, the way a person looks at a photograph they know they will not see again. Then she looked at him, and there was no anger in her face. That was the part that would stay with him longest. No triumph, no grief, nothing performed for his benefit at all. Just a kind of settled calm, the calm of someone who had already grieved this moment a long time ago and simply outlived it. "The car," Daniel finally said, because it was the only thing his mouth could produce. "Claire, whose car is that?" She almost smiled. "It's mine," she said. "It's always been mine." And then she walked past him, out the door, down the steps, into the waiting seat, and the driver closed the door behind her with a soft, final click that Daniel would hear in his sleep for months afterward. He stood in the doorway of the house he believed, until that exact moment he had built with his own two hands, and watched the car pull away into traffic, and understood, before he understood anything else, that he did not know his wife at all. To understand how a man arrives at that doorway, you have to go back. Not months, years. Back to a version of Daniel Bennett who had nothing, and a version of Claire that almost no one, including Daniel, had ever truly seen. 3 years before the car came for her, Claire was 39 years old and had already spent 2 decades perfecting the art of being underestimated. She had learned it the way people learn things that keep them alive, out of necessity, and early. Her family had money. The old, quiet, generational kind that doesn't announce itself with logos or headlines, the kind that owns buildings instead of renting floors in them. Her father, Walter Sinclair, had built an investment firm out of nothing in the 1970s and had never once, in Claire's memory, worn his success visibly. He drove a car that was 11 years old. He wore the same 3 suits in rotation. And he had taught his only daughter one lesson so many times it had become scripture. Money makes people show you who they really are, and most people, when money is in the room, will disappoint you. He had not meant it as advice about romance. He had meant it about business partners, about so-called friends who appeared the moment the Sinclair name opened a door, about the particular ugliness that surfaces in otherwise decent people when they believe there is something to be extracted from you. But Claire had learned the lesson in the most personal way possible, at 26, when she was engaged to a man named Preston Marsh. Preston had been charming and ambitious and endlessly attentive, and Claire, young enough still to mistake attention for love, had believed every bit of it. It was her father, quietly and without confrontation, who had shown her the paper trail, the inquiries Preston had made to the family's accountants, the conversations with mutual friends about how the Sinclair estate was structured, the prenup he'd had drafted before he'd even proposed, one that heavily favored him in the event of a divorce. Preston had not loved her. Preston had done diligence on her, the way you do diligence on an acquisition. She had broken the engagement in a single, quiet phone call and had never told anyone, not friends, not therapists, not the handful of men she dated in the years afterward, exactly how much that had cost her to survive. What it left her with was not bitterness, though for a while she wore something close to it. What it left her with, eventually, once the wound had scarred over into something more useful, was a private vow. If she ever loved a man again, truly loved him, she would need proof, real proof, tested over years, not weeks, that he loved the person she was, and not the numbers behind her name. She thought for a long time that such proof was impossible to gather. You cannot test a hypothesis you refuse to expose to variables. And then, on a rainy Thursday in March, she met Daniel Bennett, and an idea took root in her that she would spend the next 3 years building into a kind of architecture. She met him at a diner 2 blocks from the unemployment office of all places, not because she frequented diners near unemployment offices, but because her car had a flat tire that afternoon and she had walked into the first place with a working phone charger and a booth. Daniel was 2 tables away, alone, with a cup of coffee he was clearly nursing rather than drinking, because it was cheaper to stay than to leave, and a folder of paperwork spread in front of him that he kept reorganizing like a man trying to make bad news look different by rearranging its order. She would learn, over the following weeks, that Daniel had been a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm for 9 years, had been loyal to it in the unglamorous way that working people are loyal, showing up early, staying late, never once padding an invoice, and had been let go 4 months earlier when the company was bought out and restructured. He had a small severance that was almost gone. He had a car that needed work he couldn't afford. He had, 3 weeks before Claire met him, been quietly informed that his apartment building was being sold and that he had 60 days to find somewhere else to live. He did not tell her any of this on the day they met. What she noticed instead was smaller and, to her, more telling. When her coffee arrived and the waitress fumbled and spilled some of it, it was Daniel, a stranger, at another table, with almost nothing to his name, who got up first to help mop the counter and made sure the older waitress didn't get blamed for it by the manager who came storming out from the back. He tipped, Claire noticed later when she deliberately lingered, more than he could reasonably afford, on a bill that could not have been more than $6. It was a small thing. Claire had learned, the hard way, that small things were the only things that told the truth. She did not tell him who she was, not that day, not in the weeks that followed as their conversations moved from the diner to the sidewalk outside it, to, eventually, dinners that Claire made sure never cost more than Daniel could quietly, proudly insist on paying for. She told him her name was Claire, that she worked in consulting, a word so elastic it could mean anything, and therefore revealed nothing, and that she had grown up comfortable, a phrase she chose with surgical precision because it was true and told him almost nothing at all. She did not lie about who she loved, or how she felt, or what she wanted. She lied, if it could even be called that, only about the scale of what she had. And she told herself, in the beginning, that this was a temporary condition, a test with an expiration date. She would see who Daniel was when he believed there was nothing to gain from her, and once she knew, truly knew, she would tell him everything. She had not planned for the test to take 3 years. She had not planned either for what she would end up doing with the results. Daniel fell for her the way people fall for someone during the hardest stretch of their life, with a kind of grateful, disbelieving intensity, because she was warm and funny and asked him real questions and never once, not once, made him feel smaller for the folder of unpaid bills he no longer bothered hiding from her. He told her, 6 weeks in, sitting on the hood of his car outside her modest rented townhouse, modest because she rented it herself, deliberately, a temporary staging ground for a temporary disguise, that he didn't understand what a woman like her was doing with a guy like him. A guy like you helped a waitress who wasn't even his responsibility, Claire said, and tipped her more than he had. I know exactly what I'm doing with a guy like you, he proposed 8 months later, in a park, with a ring he had clearly saved for in a way that must have hurt, and Claire said yes with tears that were entirely real, and somewhere underneath the joy of it, a colder, more deliberate part of her mind was already turning something over. She loved him. She was sure of that in a way she had never been sure of anything with Preston. But loving him honestly did not resolve the deeper problem her father's lesson had planted in her years before. Love, once tested by circumstance, tends to answer only the question you originally asked it. She had asked whether Daniel could love her without her money. She had not yet asked the harder question, whether he could hold power, real power, the kind that changes what a man believes he is owed, without it changing him. She decided, in the weeks before the wedding, that she would find out. Quietly and from a distance he would never see. It began small enough to be invisible. 3 months after the wedding, Daniel was still unemployed, and the rejection letters had turned into the particular silence of companies that don't bother rejecting you at all anymore. Claire, through a shell entity managed by an attorney who had worked for her family for over a decade and who understood discretion the way surgeons understand sterility, quietly acquired a minority stake in a small commercial development firm that happened, entirely by chance, to have an opening for a project manager. Daniel applied. He interviewed twice. He got the job on his own merits. His resume was genuinely strong. His interview was genuinely good. But Claire had made certain, through channels Daniel would never trace, that his application landed on the right desk at the right moment, in a stack that had quietly been thinned of competition that didn't matter to her plan. She told herself this wasn't manipulation. She told herself she was simply removing bad luck from his path, the same bad luck that had nothing to do with his ability and everything to do with an economy that didn't care how hard he worked. She believed this, mostly. It was easier to believe than the alternative, that she had begun, without fully admitting it to herself, to play architect in her own husband's life. Daniel came home from his first day practically vibrating with relief, and that night, watching him fall asleep with his hand still curled loosely around hers, Claire allowed herself to feel something between comfort and unease. She had done a good thing, she told herself. She would simply have to be careful about how many more good things she did and how invisible she kept her hand. She was not careful enough, in the end. But that comes later. For the first year, Daniel worked hard and rose fast, and every promotion felt to him like proof he had finally landed on solid ground after years of standing on sand. He didn't know that the surprisingly patient investors backing the small development firm's biggest project, a mixed-use building downtown that would make the firm's name and, not incidentally, Daniel's, were represented by a holding company called Ashgrove Partners, whose ultimate beneficial owner, buried under 3 layers of trusts that even a determined forensic accountant would have needed months to unwind, was Claire. He knew Ashgrove only as the Investor Group, a faceless entity in quarterly meetings, a name on term sheets he read with pride because his signature was on the operating side of those same documents. He believed, with total sincerity, that he had earned every inch of what was happening to his career. In the truest, most human sense he worked 11-hour days, he solved problems that would have broken lesser project managers, he built relationships with contractors and city officials that had nothing to do with Claire at all. What he did not know was that the ground beneath all that effort had been quietly, deliberately leveled by his wife, so that his hard work would never once meet the kind of arbitrary bad luck that had derailed him before. It is a strange thing, to build a man's confidence out of a lie of omission. Claire told herself, in the quiet hours when she allowed herself to examine it, that she had not created anything false in Daniel. She had simply cleared debris from a road he was already capable of walking. But the man walking that road did not know it had been cleared. And a man who does not know a road has been cleared for him will, in time, begin to believe he built the road himself. It was during the second year, the year the downtown building topped out, the year Daniel was promoted to Director of Development, the year his name started appearing in local business journal Ones to Watch pieces, that a woman named Sam Whitaker began to notice things that didn't add up. Sam had been hired at the firm around the same time as Daniel, ostensibly as an operations analyst, and had quickly become one of the people Daniel trusted most. Sharp, quiet, unflappable, the kind of colleague who remembers details other people forget, and asks the one question in a meeting that everyone else was too polite to ask. What Daniel did not know, and what Sam herself had not fully disclosed even to him, was that Sam had originally been placed at the firm by the same family attorney who managed Ashgrove Partners, not as a spy exactly, though Daniel would eventually use that word, but as a set of careful eyes. Claire had wanted someone competent and trustworthy watching the day-to-day of the investment from the inside, someone who could flag a problem before it became one. She had never asked Sam to watch Daniel specifically. She had asked her to watch the deal. But Sam was good at her job, and being good at her job meant noticing patterns, and one of the patterns she noticed, about 14 months in, was that Ashgrove Partners behaved less like an institutional investor and more like something personal. Institutional investors pushed for aggressive returns, demanded board seats, threw their weight around in ways that left fingerprints. Ashgrove never did. Ashgrove's approval letters came back fast, generous, and strangely tailored, extending deadlines exactly when Daniel needed them extended, approving budget increases exactly when Daniel needed them approved, and never once pushing back on decisions Daniel made even when a more typical investor would have. It read, to Sam's trained eye, less like a fund managing risk and more like someone managing an outcome. She began, quietly, to dig. Not out of malice. Sam liked Daniel, respected him, had no interest in blowing up his career, but because the analyst in her could not leave an unexplained pattern alone. What she found, buried in filings that were technically public but practically invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, was a name repeated across 3 different holding structures, always a step removed, always behind at least one additional layer of trust. C. Sinclair Family Trust. She did not immediately connect it to Claire. Sinclair was not an uncommon name, and Claire had, since the wedding, gone by Claire Bennett in every context Sam had ever seen. It took another 6 months, and a chance sighting of an old university alumni newsletter with a young Claire Sinclair's photo in it, at a fundraising gala for a hospital wing the Sinclair family had endowed, before the pieces assembled themselves into something Sam could no longer file away as coincidence. She said nothing to Daniel. This was, in hindsight, the decision that would matter most. The other woman entered the story so quietly that no one, including Claire, marked the moment as significant at the time. Whitney Cole was hired 18 months in as the firm's new head of marketing and communications, brought on specifically to raise the profile of the downtown project, and, by extension, of Daniel, whom the firm's partners had begun positioning as the face of their next decade. Whitney was 33, magnetic in the practiced way of someone who has spent a career being looked at, and very good at her job. Press features, a polished LinkedIn presence, a carefully curated appearance at every industry event that mattered. She and Daniel worked closely together for the better part of a year before anything shifted between them, and even then, it shifted the way these things often do, slowly, deniably, in 100 small moments that were each, individually, defensible. What almost no one at the firm knew, not Daniel, not Claire, not even Sam, not yet, was that Whitney had her own complicated relationship to ambition. She had watched 2 previous relationships with powerful men collapse the moment those men's fortunes reversed, and had privately promised herself she would never again attach her future to someone else's rising star without first understanding exactly how stable that star really was. She was not, whatever Daniel would later want to believe in his angriest moments, a woman chasing love. She was a woman doing quiet, careful diligence of her own, watching Daniel's trajectory, watching the money behind it, watching for the moment when the story he told about himself and the story the paperwork told about him might diverge. She had not yet found what she was looking for, but she was looking. By the time the affair began, and it did begin, in the unglamorous, common way these things do, over long nights finishing press materials before a launch, over a bottle of wine that turned into two. Daniel had changed in ways that were easy for Claire to see and impossible for him to admit. He had started correcting Claire in front of colleagues at dinners she rarely attended anymore, because he rarely invited her. He had started referring to my building and my deal in a way he never used to, the possessive pronoun expanding to swallow every hand that had ever touched the project besides his own. Once at a firm holiday party Claire did attend, she overheard him telling a junior associate, with a warmth that had curdled somewhere along the way into something closer to condescension, that the difference between people who make it and people who don't isn't luck, it's grit. A sentence that landed on Claire with a quiet, private violence, because she alone in that room knew exactly how much of his grit had been quietly cushioned by luck he had never been allowed to see. She did not confront him, not yet. She was by then watching him the way she had once watched a stack of due diligence documents on Preston Marsh, carefully, and with a growing, sinking certainty about what she would eventually find. She found it on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of discovery that never announces itself with drama. Daniel had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he showered, and a message notification slid across the top of the screen from a name Claire had heard exactly twice, in passing, as Whitney from marketing. The message did not need context. Some sentences carry their own unmistakable weight, and this one did. Claire did not slam the laptop shut. She did not cry, not then. She stood very still in her kitchen for what felt like a long time, and something in her, something old, something that had been waiting patiently since a phone call to Preston Marsh 13 years earlier, settled into a terrible, familiar calm. She thought, absurdly, of her father. Money makes people show you who they really are. She had not needed money to find this out. She had needed only patience and time and a man's own certainty that he had earned everything he had. Daniel asked for the divorce 4 weeks later, on a Sunday evening, in the kitchen, with the particular businesslike briskness of a man who has rehearsed a conversation he believes he holds all the leverage in. He told Claire he had grown, that they had grown apart, that he needed a life that matched who he'd become. He did not mention Whitney by name, not that night, as though the omission preserved some dignity he was no longer entitled to. He talked instead about the house, about the timeline, about being reasonable, a word he used 4 times in 10 minutes, each time as though he were doing Claire an enormous favor by not destroying her financially. A woman he believed, with total sincerity, had nothing of her own beyond what his success had allowed her to enjoy. "I built this," he said, gesturing at nothing in particular and everything at once. "The house, the car in the driveway, the life. I know that's hard to hear, but I built this, Claire, from nothing." Claire looked at him for a long moment. She thought about telling him everything, right there in the kitchen, and watching his face change in real time. She thought about it seriously enough that her hand had actually reached for her phone, where a single email to her attorney would have begun unwinding 3 years of careful architecture in a matter of days. She did not send it, not yet. "Okay," she said instead, quietly. "If that's what you need." Daniel would tell people, later, that her calm that night was the moment he knew he'd made the right decision, that she'd simply given up, that she didn't have the fight in her because she didn't have anything to fight with. He mistook her stillness for surrender the same way, 3 years earlier, he had mistaken a series of remarkable coincidences for his own unassisted rise. It was, Claire would reflect later, the single most consistent thing about him, an almost total inability to imagine that a woman standing quietly in a room might be doing something other than losing. What Daniel did not know, what almost no one but Claire's attorney knew, was that Claire had spent those 4 weeks since discovering the affair doing exactly what her father had trained her to do her whole life. Due diligence. Not on Whitney. Not even really on Daniel anymore. On the structure of what she had built, and on precisely how, and in what order, and at what pace, she intended to let it become visible. The unraveling did not happen all at once. And that, more than anything, is what made it unbearable for Daniel to live through. It began with the building. 3 weeks into the separation, a letter arrived at the firm, not from Ashgrove Partners directly, but from the trust attorney representing it, regarding a lease renewal on the ground floor retail space of the downtown building, the crown jewel of Daniel's career. Buried in the language of the letter, in a clause Daniel had signed without reading closely 3 years earlier, because Ashgrove's paperwork had always been, mysteriously, so painless, was a change of control provision. And attached to that provision, for the first time in 3 years, was a name that Ashgrove Partners had never before been required to disclose in any document Daniel had personally seen: the trust's authorized signatory, Claire Sinclair Bennett. Daniel read it twice before the words rearranged themselves into something he could understand, and then, apparently, a third time, because Sam, who was in his office when it arrived, and who had been carrying the weight of what she knew for over a year, without ever finding the right moment, or, if she was honest with herself, the courage to say it, watched his face do something she would later describe, when Claire eventually asked her about it, as a house falling in on itself, floor by floor, very quietly. "Sam," Daniel said, his voice strange to his own ears. "Sam, do you know anything about this?" And Sam, who had spent 18 months protecting a secret that was never really hers to protect, finally told him what she knew. Not everything, because she did not know everything, but enough. Enough about the pattern of Ashgrove's approvals. Enough about the sea. Sinclair Family Trust buried 3 layers deep in the filings. Enough for Daniel to understand, sitting in the office of a building he had believed, with his whole chest, that he had built from nothing, that he had built it, instead, inside a structure his wife had constructed around him without his knowledge, for reasons he could not yet begin to guess. "You knew," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I suspected," Sam said. "For a long time. I didn't know what to do with it. It wasn't my marriage to blow up, Daniel. And for what it's worth, none of it changes the work you actually did. The work was real." He did not find that comforting, not then. He called Claire that night, and she did not deny it. She had decided, weeks earlier, that once the first thread was pulled, she would not lie about what unraveled from it, only control the pace. She confirmed, in a voice that Daniel would later describe as the calmest he had ever heard her, that yes, Ashgrove Partners was hers, that yes, the investment in the firm that hired him had not been coincidence, that yes, she had known, from very early on, more about the architecture of his career than he had ever known himself. What she did not tell him that night, what she let him discover 4 days later, on his own, digging through years of financial filings with the increasingly desperate energy of a man trying to disprove his own life, was the full shape of it, that the surprisingly patient backer of every major deal the firm had done in 3 years traced back to her, that the small development firm itself, the one whose job posting had appeared so conveniently the week he'd needed it most, had received an infusion of capital from Ashgrove 8 months before Daniel had ever walked through its doors, capital that had, quite literally, created the position he'd been hired into. That the lucky break everyone in the industry still talked about, the moment 3 years ago when a larger competitor's bid on the downtown site had mysteriously fallen through at the last minute, clearing the way for Daniel's firm to win it, had not been mysterious at all. Ashgrove had quietly acquired the competitor's debt and called it due at precisely the moment that mattered. Each revelation did not simply add information. Each one reached backward and rewrote a memory Daniel had cherished. The night he'd come home elated about his first promotion, certain it was earned entirely on merit, now sat differently in his memory, tinged with a question he couldn't answer, had it been. Any of it? The morning he'd stood in front of the finished downtown building and felt for the first time in his adult life unambiguously proud of himself. That morning, too, now felt like something that had happened to a man standing on ground he hadn't known was engineered beneath him. It was in the middle of this unraveling, while Daniel was still absorbing the scale of what his wife had built and hidden, that the second twist arrived. And it did not come from Claire at all. Whitney ended things with him on a Thursday, in a text message so brief it took Daniel 3 readings to understand it was truly over. He drove to her apartment that night, half out of his mind, and she let him in only long enough to say what she had apparently been rehearsing, in her own way, for weeks. "I need you to understand something," Whitney said, standing very deliberately near her own door, not inviting him further in. "I didn't fall for the version of you that turns out to have been someone else's project the whole time. Daniel, I'm not built for that kind of uncertainty. I watched 2 men lose everything, because the ground under them wasn't really theirs, and I promised myself I'd never do that again. I did my own homework on you, a long time ago, and everything checked out. The company checked out, the deal checked out. What I didn't know, what nobody could have found, because it wasn't hidden badly, it was hidden well, is that none of it was really yours to begin with." She paused. "I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because I think you need to hear it from someone who isn't her. You didn't lose me because of anything you did. You lost me because I finally understood what you actually have, and it isn't what either of us thought it was." Daniel stood on her doorstep for a long time after she closed the door, and it occurred to him, bitterly, uselessly, far too late, that in his rush to leave a woman he'd wrongly believed had nothing of her own, he had run directly into another woman who had, in her own careful way, been doing exactly what Claire had done to him 3 years earlier, watching, testing, deciding whether what she saw could be trusted before she let herself believe in it. The difference was that Whitney's test had a floor Daniel had failed to meet the moment the ground turned out to be borrowed. He went back to Claire's, their house that night, and found it dark, and let himself in with a key that some part of him understood, correctly, he would not be using much longer. Claire agreed to the divorce 3 days later, still without anger, in a conference room with both their attorneys present, and it was there, watching her sign documents with the same steady hand she'd used to sign 1,000 documents before that Daniel had never known about, that the largest and final piece of the reveal arrived, not from Claire's mouth, but from her attorneys, in the dry, procedural language of asset division. The firm Daniel had spent 3 years believing he'd built into something significant was not, structurally, half his to divide. It never had been. Ashgrove Partners' stake, Claire's stake, had been drafted, from the very beginning, with protections so thorough that Daniel's own operational role, however real and however hard-earned, had never converted into the kind of ownership he'd spent 3 years assuming it had. He had built the deal. He had not, in any legal sense that mattered now, owned it. "You planned this," Daniel said, when the attorneys stepped out for a moment, and it was just the 2 of them at the long conference table. His voice had lost the anger of the earlier weeks. What was left underneath it sounded almost like awe, the way people sound when they finally understand the true size of something they'd spent years standing too close to see clearly. "From the beginning, you planned all of it, even this room." Claire considered the question honestly, because for the first time in a long time, she felt she owed him that. "I planned to protect myself," she said. "I didn't plan to fall in love with you. That part was real, Daniel. I need you to understand that, because I think it matters, even now. I planned a test. I never planned for 3 years to become a marriage I actually wanted to keep. And I never planned for you to become someone I'd eventually need protecting from. So this whole thing," he said, "the job, the building, all of it, that was never me. It was always you," Claire said. "I never once wrote a proposal, negotiated a contractor, walked a job site, or convinced a city council to approve a variance. That was entirely yours. What I did was make sure the world stopped getting in your way long enough for people to actually see it." She paused. "I didn't build your competence, Daniel. I built your opportunity. And somewhere in there, you stopped being able to tell the difference, and you started believing the second thing was the first thing. That's not a lie I told you. That's a truth you told yourself, because it was easier to live with." He had no answer for that. He sat with it for a long moment, and something in his face, Claire would tell a friend much later, looked less like anger finally, and more like grief. The particular grief of a man realizing that the story he'd told about himself at every dinner party, every industry panel, every proud phone call to his mother, had been, in its most flattering and most repeated form, not entirely true. The final piece, the piece that made the whole architecture visible in a single, undeniable image, came on the day Daniel finally moved his remaining boxes out of the house, 6 weeks after the conference room, on a gray Tuesday afternoon in early autumn. He had, by then, learned most of what there was to know. He knew about the trust. He knew about Sam, who had left the firm 2 weeks earlier for a position Daniel would later learn, without much surprise, had been quietly arranged through Claire's family network, not as a reward for loyalty to Claire specifically, but as fair acknowledgement that Sam had spent 18 months navigating an impossible position with more integrity than the situation had any right to expect. He knew, roughly, the scale of what Ashgrove Partners represented, though even then he suspected, correctly, that he had not yet seen the full picture, and never entirely would. Some things, he was beginning to understand, a person is allowed to keep. What he had not fully absorbed, until that black car pulled up outside the house, was what all of it looked like, gathered into a single moment. He watched from the window as the driver stepped out and opened the door, and something in him, some final, stubborn corner of the man who had spent 3 years believing he'd built an empire from nothing, still expected, right up until she came down the stairs, that this was some kind of mistake, some rental car, some friend doing her a favor. It was not until Claire said the words, "It's mine, it's always been mine," that the last piece slid into place. Not as new information exactly, but as something that had been true the entire time, finally rendered visible. He did not chase her down the driveway. There would have been nothing to say that either of them hadn't already, in one way or another, said. He stood in the doorway and watched the car pull away, and stayed there long after it had disappeared around the corner, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its brutality, that the woman who had just left him had never once, in 3 years, needed him to build her anything. She had spent 3 years quietly building him instead, and had walked away, in the end, with nothing diminished, because nothing she'd ever truly owned had ever depended on him at all. Claire did not look back at the house as the car pulled away. She had done her looking back already, in the kitchen, on the stairs, in the doorway. What she felt, settling into the leather seat with the city sliding by the window, was not triumph, though she understood why people watching this story from the outside might expect her to feel that. Triumph requires an opponent you're still measuring yourself against, and Daniel, by that point, had stopped being someone she measured herself against at all. What she felt, instead, was something closer to the particular relief of setting down a weight she had carried for so long she had nearly forgotten it wasn't simply part of her. She thought of her father, briefly, and of Preston Marsh, whose name she had not allowed herself to think about in years, and of the phone call she'd made at 26 that had felt, at the time, like the end of her ability to trust anyone with the truth of what she had. She understood now, in a way she hadn't quite understood 3 years ago when she'd first sat across a diner booth from a tired, kind man mopping up spilled coffee that wasn't his mess to clean, that the test she had built for Daniel had never really been about him at all. It had been about her, about whether she could still let herself love someone without disappearing into the disguise she wore to protect herself from being loved for the wrong reasons. She had gotten her answer, eventually. It had simply taken her 3 years and a divorce to fully understand what the answer was. In the months that followed, Daniel's life reorganized itself around the absence of things he had once assumed were simply his. The firm restructured its ownership once Ashgrove's true position became clear to the remaining partners, and though Daniel kept his role, kept his salary, kept the professional respect of colleagues who, in the end, had always known the work itself was genuinely his, something in the way people looked at him had quietly, permanently shifted. He was no longer the self-made story the local business journal had once profiled. He was, instead, a competent man who had built a real career inside a house someone else had built around him, and there is a particular, humbling adjustment required to live inside that more honest version of your own biography. Whitney, in the end, moved on quickly, in the practiced way of someone for whom this had been, whatever else it was, also a diligence exercise that had simply returned an unfavorable result. She would tell a friend, months later, over drinks, that she didn't regret leaving, only that she regretted, a little, how long it had taken her to ask the right questions before she let herself get attached to the wrong ones. Claire built something new. Not from nothing. She had never, in her entire life, had the luxury of building anything from nothing, and had stopped pretending, even to herself, that this was a failing rather than simply a fact, but from everything she had spent 3 years quietly proving she was capable of, unassisted by anyone's belief in her but her own. She took a more visible role at the family firm, one she had avoided for years out of the same instinct that had once made her rent a modest townhouse and call her work consulting. She stopped disguising herself, not because the disguise had failed, but because she finally understood she no longer needed it to find out what she needed to know. Years later, when people who had heard fragments of the story, because stories like this one never stay entirely private, however carefully constructed, asked her why she had done it, why she had spent 3 years hiding something so large from a man she loved, Claire would give the same answer every time, and it was, unlike almost everything else about those 3 years, entirely true. "I didn't hide my money from him," she would say. "I hid it from the version of him I was afraid he might become. I just didn't expect, for a long time, that those would turn out to be the same man." And then, because it was the part of the story she found herself returning to most, in the quiet moments when she let herself think about all of it honestly, she would add one thing more. The hardest part was never the hiding. The hardest part was learning, finally, that I didn't have to. The car that came for her that gray Tuesday afternoon had been waiting, in one sense, for 3 years. In another sense, she would come to understand, it had been waiting far longer than that, since a phone call at 26, since a lesson her father had taught her before she'd ever needed it, since the very first moment she had decided that loving someone honestly and protecting herself completely were 2 things she would have to learn, eventually, how to do at the very same time. She had learned it, in the end. It had simply cost her a marriage to find out.